Hey, everybody. Welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. I am Walter, but going by Walt today.
I'm Rob, and today we're very pleased to have the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, Walter Kim. And Walter has been the president since 2020. And beforehand, he was previously my pastor at Trinity Presbyterian Church here in Charlottesville, Virginia. But he was also a pastor before that for a very long time at the historic Park Street Baptist Church in Boston. And we're going to just talk to him a little bit today. Our first hardball question, Walter, how do you take your coffee?
Well, I take it black. Just give it to me straight. And let me say thank you for having me on.
Well,
Appreciate
thank you
the
for making
conversation
time
that
for
we
us.
will have.
Yeah.
Do you
Okay.
do you put anything in it, or not? Take black. What roast do you like?
I tend to like a medium roast,
Mhm.
and uh, yeah, medium roast.
Yeah, I would say this, and I say it often. I think McDonald's has, and they don't give us any advertisement, but McDonald's has the best medium roast value, medium light roast. It best value and best taste. So I think it's a good midway point. I don't know that any for the price point. I haven't really found any other coffee that it for me personally. So, but anyway, so Walter, what is your story? Can you kind of tell us a bit about yourself? How did you get to become the president of the NAE?
Yeah. Well, in terms of my story, let me go back a bit. I'm the son of an immigrant and refugee. Did not grow up in with faith in the sense that though we went to church, it wasn't really a vital aspect of my life. It was something more of a cultural expression,
Okay.
uh, partly with my ethnic identity when we were living in New York City and going to a Korean church. And then when I was living in Western Pennsylvania, it was more a function of just being a part of the community.
Okay.
So my coming to faith really was in high school, and it was a pretty dramatic conversion that launched me into a world that
Mm.
was evangelical, though I didn't even know the name evangelical. I mean, that
Right.
wasn't even part of my vocabulary. All I
Right.
knew was I encountered Jesus in this radically transformative way. And
Wow.
then over the years, had left a possible medical career to go into ministry, ended up studying in the Boston area and working in a church, which is Park Street Church that Rob had mentioned.
Okay.
And Park Street Church was really a part of American religious life. It's over a 200-year-old church,
Wow.
and
Man.
the NAE was founded out of Park Street Church. Christianity Today, a number of seminaries, and other institutions were fomented or arose out of the work of Park Street Church. And so, as I was attending and then on staff there, I began to hear about organizations like World Relief, which is the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals, and of course, hearing about the NAE itself.
Okay.
So, eventually came on the board of the NAE, and then in 2020, had the privilege of entering into service as its president.
Okay. Can you give us a short history of the NAE? What are some of the milestones for those of us who do not know?
Yeah. So, it's remarkable some of the similarities that exist at the beginning of the NAE's life and our current moment. So, the world, went through a pandemic in 1918, only to be followed by a Great Depression, and that to be followed by a World War.
Lord have
And in the midst of all these cultural and global chaos, the church itself in America, in particular, was being riven by this kind of divide between theological liberalism, fundamentalism, cultural identity. I mean,
mercy.
it was a real mix of things.
Yeah.
And in 1942, a number of religious leaders got together and said, "There's got to be a third way." So in 1942, they gathered in St. Louis with the hopes of a prayerful and thoughtful consideration of what would a third way be that would
Hmm.
be historically orthodox but engaged with the cultural issues rather than a posture of hostility but a posture of engagement.
Right.
And that gave birth to the NAE. And then over the decades, the NAE has, ebbed and flowed in terms of its strength and focus, but it was instrumental in a number of initiatives, like World Relief as an
Mhm.
example of this, um, the NIV translation of the Bible
Oh, oh, wow,
was
that
an
can be
idea
amazing.
that was precipitated in conversations at the NAE.
Okay.
And as an organization, we represent 40 different denominations: Pentecostals, Presbyterians, Methodists, Mennonites, Brethren Baptists. And it was one of the first places where a number of these denominations actually engaged with one another
Hmm.
in meaningful collaboration. And so its work kind of came out in a moment that uh, has some similarities to our present moment.
Okay. Okay.
So you've already mentioned World Relief a few times. I noticed that World Relief was founded in 1944 as a kind of refugee humanitarian organization. In what ways has it changed over the past almost 80 years? And in what ways has it stayed the same?
Yeah. Yeah, so it actually started in 1944, as you mentioned, as the War Relief Fund, again, out of Park Street Church. The church, as it was seeing the conclusion of the war in Europe, was deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis, displaced people, extreme poverty, the rebuilding of nations that hopefully would be on a better footing to pursue lasting peace. And so there was a call during the season of Lent to spend some time fasting. And in that fasting, to donate the money that would have been used for food. And that war relief fund um, that really saw a lot of success gave rise to this. Well, let's maybe make this a bit more permanent rather than just a war relief fund. What would it look like for us to do this work not simply in Europe but globally? So, and this maybe gets to a little bit of my own story. In the 1950s, World Relief had founded, I think, 130 feeding centers in South Korea. And during the Korean War and its conclusion. This was precisely the time that my father had escaped communist China, literally crossing a river in a barrel with his family to get to South Korea.
Oh man.
And it was in South Korea that my, mom, who was a child at that time, and my father, who was a teenager at that time, they had encountered people of faith. And so that kind of work that presents the gospel in word and in deed, um, is very instrumental in the expansion of gospel presence throughout the world. So I have a deep fond spot for World Relief because of how it served Korea at a time where my own parents were in profound need. And I think this work is fantastic, and it's now expanded to the most vulnerable in many, many parts of the world: Africa, Southeast Asia, and I think is a wonderful expression of the gospel in word and deed.
So a little bit current event question. How does the NAE look to respond with the seems like almost probable impending decision by the Supreme Court, either with overturning Roe versus Wade or at least supplanting Casey, that's Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that kind of went from trimester limits that Roe had to viability limits. So at least looks like the court is at least primed to supplant Casey with Dobbs. Dobbs would be heartbeat, Roe v. Wade being just generally abortion. So in general, how does NAA look to respond with this pretty already intense cultural flashpoint?
Yeah, we've been involved in a number of ways. So, in the Dobbs case, for instance, the NAE wrote a friend of the court brief for the Supreme Court case. So we certainly have some space in the advocacy realm, representing um, the position of evangelical Christians or Orthodox Christians. We joined together with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in authoring these friend of court briefs in these cases. So, on the one hand, there's a robust commitment to the issue of the sanctity of life. But we've always viewed this at the NAE for decades, really. I mean, this is a posture that we've had for decades as an issue of womb to tomb. So it's not merely the advocacy for the sanctity of life with respect to abortion, though that is an incredibly significant issue, again, as represented by our amicus brief. But we view this as an issue of life that encompasses what happens to a person after they're born into family systems. So for this reason, we've also been committed to crisis pregnancy centers as a part of our robust denominational work. We've also entered into discussions about things like the child tax credit from a perspective of how can we empower families on the cusp of poverty with financial resources that enable them to make decisions to preserve life. And so
Yeah.
we recognize that a robust response is not merely a response to overturning a particular legal decision or precedent. It's creating the context in which life can flourish, not simply in the womb, but after the womb.
Yeah.
And not simply with respect to the child, but to family systems and communities that enable children to thrive, enable families to make these decisions. So it's a complicated thing. We recognize incredibly complicated. And my concern is that the church will be ill-equipped to work in this more comprehensive way to support life in the breadth of life. Again, not simply in the womb, but all the way up to the tomb.
Yep.
Yeah, I think Tish Harrison Warren just recently wrote a New York Times op-ed, kind of arguing, either way how this goes, we need Christians and especially more evangelicals to start moving towards this pro-life position to a whole life. I think is what you're getting at. And she had some great examples. One of them is just like we need to have better economics. She's not an economist, so she didn't really delve too far into that, but just, how does someone uplift the poor? Because the poor, whether it's whites or blacks or Asians, it is the poor, or Hispanics, it is the poor that most often seek abortions in the house, most often because of economic stress. Yeah. A kind of just more general follow-up on what we've been talking about. What are some of the intra-denominational work that the NAE does? Clearly, clearly some pro-life stuff, clearly immigration with world relief. What are some other examples that you could just give? I know that's kind of a follow-up question.
Yeah, I think there are a few ways that we can think about this. There are four areas of emphasis within the NAE. One is the equipping of the church, and that's the production of resources or events and opportunities for the church to be strengthened, and it can include the denominational executives retreat that we host annually, a place for the executives of these various denominations that I had mentioned to come together, to pray for one another, to share best practices, to encourage one another. And I have to say, in the recent denominational executives retreat, they were so engaged with one another that they were actually inviting each other to present at their annual conferences. And it just struck me like, here's a picture of would the CEO of Pepsi invite the CEO of Coca-Cola to give an address at the shareholders meeting?
Right.
What a beautiful picture of church leaders saying, let's keep the main thing, and how can we strengthen one another? So one is, kind of equipping the church and producing resources, opportunities for that. The NAE is also the largest endorsing agency of chaplains. So we work with these various denominations to endorse, continue to train, equip chaplains in all the branches of the military. And post pandemic, real growth areas have been in the hospitals, nursing homes, educational institutions. I've been hearing stories of chaplains who have been working in meatpacking factories during the pandemic, helping with immigrant communities, with childcare resources, learning English as a second language, and feeding America. Um, and so we have that going on. We also have, um, this kind of connection with uh, the issue of equipping the church and empowering the church for its work. So, in the wake of Ukraine, for instance, Salvation Army, Compassion International, World Vision, these are all Samaritan's Purse, these are all member organizations of the NAE. So the NAE has been able to provide some opportunities and connective tissue for these organizations to be able to work with one another and for the denominations represented in Ukraine. Um, Lastly, I would say we do have this kind of public policy part. We don't endorse politicians. We're not in the business of lobbying and doing that kind of endorsement of particular candidates, but we do want to equip the church to have a nuanced understanding of the complex issues, how to navigate complexity with kind of biblical clarity and charity. And so, one way we do this is through our document for the health of the nation, which is what are the posture and various positions that followers of Jesus could pursue in a comprehensive application of the gospel in our civil life.
Thank you. Um, how has your story from immigrant parents to living in what you described as a fading coal town in Western Pennsylvania impacted you as not only a pastor, but also now as your current job as a leader of the NAE?
Yeah, I think in a few ways. One, I moved around a lot as a kid. So I was born in New York City, lived there, lived in New Jersey, and in Western Pennsylvania, lived in several towns, but along the Appalachian Mountains, and many of them kind of these fading coal towns. But I've also lived in Chicago, Pittsburgh, in Vancouver. I mean, just a lot of different places. And how it's really helped me in my work is it's given me an insight. Oh, and on top of that, I married a Texan, so that gives me another insight. Yeah.
All right.
So there are just profound differences in the regions of America, and it's really easy when you're in a particular community to assume that America is that community. Like what that community represents is what America is. But really, America is multiple Americas depending on where you live. And I would say that's true of evangelicalism. There's
Yeah.
not evangelicalism, there's evangelicalisms. There are like many rooms to the house of evangelicalism.
Right.
And living in these different places has given me, I think, a firsthand experience of different types of evangelicalism. And that really is helpful in my work at the NAE. I think as a son of an immigrant refugee, I've also made my peace with being bicultural.
Right.
And, when the Bible describes Christians as being aliens and strangers on earth,
Yeah.
citizens of another kingdom, I resonate with that intuitively of
Mhm.
like, wow, I'm always having to navigate what it means to be Korean American.
Yeah.
And there's something really important in our moment right now as Christianity is more and more on the margins of society. It's no longer, at the center
Right.
of
Right.
American life. We have both an opportunity that is before us and a challenge. It's a challenge
Yeah.
to no longer lead from the center, from positions of power, but from the margin.
Mhm.
But it's also an amazing opportunity to relearn what it means to be citizens of two kingdoms, citizen of America, but more importantly, a citizen of heaven,
Yeah.
and how to lead not from a position of power, but from the margin. I think it's really important, and I think um, being someone with this bicultural experience
Yeah.
gives me some intuition for what that's like.
Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break and have a word from a sponsor. Shenandoah Coffee Roasters has been a staple of Charlottesville since 1993. They offer over 25 varieties of specialty, boutique, and gourmet coffee using only the finest Arabia coffee from all over the world. Coffee is their passion, and they painstakingly search out the best coffee available. Nothing is taken for granted as they continually strive to provide the best coffee they possibly can. They roast all their coffees to order based on the needs of their espresso bar, ensuring that only the freshest and highest quality coffee leaves their roasting house. Grab a cup at any of their 3 locations, Main Restaurant Preston, on the corner, or on Ivy Road, or order a bag online at shenandoahjoe.com. My last question for a while, and then I'm going to throw it over to Walt. How has your previous role as a pastor at both Park Street Baptist in Boston and Trinity Presbyterian here in Charlottesville prepared you for a much more political-ish role at the NAE?
Yeah. So Park Street, it's not a Baptist church. It's just Park Street Church, congregational church, actually more akin to Presbyterianism in some ways in terms of
That's
doctrine.
my bad.
Yeah,
Excuse me.
no problem. Um, I think it's less about Park Street Church and more about life in Boston. So, Boston is very much a progressive, liberal city. Has been post-Christian for decades. Um, highly cosmopolitan, intellectual city. And what does it look like to navigate faith in that area? Um, and my life in Charlottesville has put me in a very different spot, different cultural experience, pastoring in a different context. And while Charlottesville may be this little dot of blue politically, it's a dot of blue within kind of a sea of red of rural central Virginia. And it's a different environment. I think between both places, um, it has helped me to clarify that there's a difference between allegiance to the person of Jesus, commitment to certain theological and moral principles, how that gets worked out in the public policy of our national life, and lastly, what does that look like when it comes to our affiliations with political parties? And so this person to principle to policy to politics, and now increasingly to polarized partisanship. So, as you can tell, I'm a pastor at heart, so I just had to alliterate all of that.
Get the alliteration out. Got to do
and
it.
and I think my work with NAE, we want to keep Jesus, the person of Jesus, always central. We want to explore Scripture and be committed to the moral and theological principles of a full-orbed gospel.
Yeah.
We want to advocate for certain policies, but increasingly recognize that while there's clarity in our commitment to Jesus, the person, while there's a robust articulation of biblical principles, that when we get into the realm of policy, we are working with wisdom there. You just have to be gracious. And
Yeah.
then when you think about how those policies get translated into, well, what does that mean for who do you vote for in terms of politics? Again, this is where the NAE kind of stops. We focus on the policy and recognize that for a variety of reasons, we don't want to be enmeshed in the politics of things. Because there's such not only diversity, but I think there's also a little bit of danger once
Yeah.
you enter into that kind of political aspect, certainly as a national organization.
Yeah. So I like the alliteration that you gave, the 5 Ps, and granted that there's a lot of partisan politics that are happening right now. There's the hot button issues that have been here for a while, but like for instance, abortion, there's CRT, there's the border, these, again, different issues. But the reality is, like, people are across the spectrum in terms of what their solution to it. And my question is geared towards, how do we, yeah, okay, so how do we move more towards civic engagement that is not partisan, but even how do we move to civic engagement that's gracious, that says, you know what, we may disagree, but how do we be gracious with one another? And granted, I don't know what that means in terms of implementing policy, right? But what would you recommend, or how do you encourage people to be gracious to one another? And I think the other side of it is, um, how should we, as evangelicals, respond when a politician may be stoking fear, or maybe driving something with fear versus versus driving something with the kingdom?
Walt, those are really important and challenging questions for a moment right now.
Yeah.
You know, if I had my um, ability and dream to be able to implement this, I would love for everyone just to apply James 1:19.
Yeah.
You know, dear brothers and sisters, take note of this, that everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires.
Yeah.
And and you know, so my fundamental commitment is to hold together not only biblical principles, which again, when they turn into policy and then politics,
Hmm.
we're going to have differences. But along with the biblical principles, there's the biblical posture, a certain ethos that we need to take that is incredibly important. And it shows up in this comment that we have in James. You know, what would it look like for us to be quick to listen, slow to speak? And we're slow to speak. Why? Because if you're really quick to listen, you're not spending the time listening, trying to come up with your rebuttal, which is what we do most often. You know, we listen to someone, but we're not really listening. We're just constructing our counter argument. But when you're quick to listen, you're really slow to speak because you've spent all your time trying to really understand the other person.
Right.
So I think this is the missionary heart of followers of Jesus, that we seek to not simply explain, but to empathize. And we seek to empathize because this is how we win people over. You
Hmm.
know, like the Jesus who came into this world, incarnating the love of, you know, God. Um, I think the 30 years of presence in this world enabled the 3 years of ministry. If Jesus himself, our Lord and Savior, had that balance of things, of like, I'm just going to be present with humanity for 30 years,
Right.
and then I'll enter into my 3-year ministry. Well, I think we have something to learn. What does it mean for us to really enter into the life of others, understand them, empathize with them, be present with them, and then to earn the right to speak? So, yeah, that kind of posture, I think, would really be transformative. Um,
So here's a question, and it just came up. Sorry, because I think me and my wife struggle with this. So we live in Richardson, Texas, which is, I mean, it's the perfect location because we're right by two major highways. But it's the reality that we're very much in suburban America. It's not inherently cheap. It's not like super expensive to live here, but it's not cheap. We're kind of, where we live. It's really funny because, like, where we live, we're close to kind of lower income area per se for Richardson. And my question is, how would you encourage people to be present and engage with, I guess you could say, even the least of these, or um, how to be present and engage in suburban America? Because I feel like some of our issues aren't, like, we're not worried about, oh, where we're going to get our next meal. We're not worried about opportunities, and we know that those things affect the least of they affect people. So I think my question is, how is the NAE, or how provide, what am I trying to ask? How do we be present in the midst of suburban America, which I think is really easy to be comfortable.
You're right. It is very easy to be comfortable. Why else would you move to suburbia?
Right.
You want your yard and space. But what I've discovered, and sociologists, demographers have borne this out, that even in suburbia, the proximity to communities that are different is not as great as one would think. I mean, certain
Okay.
suburbs it can be,
Right.
but for many suburbs of urban centers, um, you're not that far off from the communities that are yours, even in your neighborhood. They're
Mm.
just invisible to you.
Mm.
Um, I'll give you an example. I used to live in Cambridge, Boston, um, and in many parts of Cambridge, there's incredible wealth and capital. Um, 2 blocks from uh, headquarters of Google and Microsoft is down there. 2 blocks from MIT, kind of this hotbed of all the wealth and intellectual capital that exists in Cambridge, in the world, really, and focused in there at Cambridge.
Right.
Just 2 blocks from these institutions and corporations, there's a school that my daughter attended, and 80% of the kids were on low income food programs
Hmm.
at that school. Just 2 blocks from MIT and
Great.
Google.
Yeah.
But if you walk in the halls of MIT and Google, you would have no idea just 2 blocks away. So, one, I would say people are actually closer to difference than they probably realize. The second thing is those in suburbs are used to travel. They travel for work,
Yeah.
they travel for baseball games,
Yep.
they are willing to travel an hour to take their kids to soccer practice.
Yep.
Um, what would it look like to add to the normalization of that travel? Like, you think nothing of going an hour to go shopping,
Hmm.
to just go an hour in a different direction to visit people who are different from who you are. It is not as difficult as it would appear to be. One, they're closer than you imagine. And two, it's already pretty normal for suburban people to travel to get to most of the things in their lives.
Right.
Why not add, if it's truly important to you, why not add relationship building, engagement in these other areas? So it's that kind of proximity that begins to humanize these issues, and it, I think, would be transformational.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. So let me ask you this: is how, again, these might be a little bit more political questions. How do Christians who are both conservative and liberal, and let me phase it this way. I used to work for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, interdenominational, right? College ministry. I've had conversations with people. I'm like, I 100% disagree with you, right? And one of the main ones I can remember is we at our Urbana conference. There was a gentleman from, I believe, Kenya named Oscar Muru who came and preached. And I remember very vividly, he said, the church in America cannot say to the church in the rest of the world, we do not need you. And I was like, bull crap, we can't. We're America. And right. And but the Lord wrecked me because I was like, he's not just the God of America, he's the God of the world. Right. So that was a significant ideological difference between me and the pastor, but the Lord used it to change me. So how do Christians, conservative, liberal, work to get together on issues that are divisive, and or I think, yeah, how do we work together on issues in order to spread further the kingdom of God?
So much depends on the framing of the question. You can ask the question, how do people who have differences work together? Okay. That emphasizes the difference
Okay.
versus how do people who have so much in common work together?
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
So again, we have gotten to the point that we assume tribalism, we assume difference, and we accentuate those differences in the self perpetuating cycle of tribalism.
Mm.
When by and large, we all want to love our kids and give them opportunities, well, that's a pretty big thing.
Right.
We all want truth, goodness, beauty in our lives. Like, that's like much of life.
Mhm.
We all know what it means to have a friend, and we all know what it means to have been lonely these past years of the pandemic. I think Zoom fatigue was equal opportunity. I think Democrats and Republicans both had Zoom fatigue.
Yeah.
Um, so when we consider the question and frame it in ways that accentuate difference, we set people up to look for difference and begin there
Yeah.
rather than set them up for looking for the vast range of things that really are common
Mhm.
and then to put our differences within that context. And so in marriage, counseling, having served as a pastor, I often will encourage couples who have these profound differences to think about, don't think about the problem as rooted as in each other, but think of the problem as a third thing, that
Mm.
you together have a problem. It is this thing. The problem is not in you or in the other person. The problem is between you, and it is this third thing. What would it look like for you to team together to solve this problem? It's a real problem, but again, it's how you frame it. If you view the person as the problem rather than the issue as the problem, then you begin in a very different spot. So, um, this the political moment is one in which we have viewed the Republicans are the problem, the Democrats are the problem. The problem is rooted in them, as
Right.
opposed to the Democrats and the Republicans. They both have problems that they're trying to solve, albeit in vastly different ideological ways. But once again, when you say that the problem is a distinct third thing as opposed to rooted in the other person,
Right.
it's a very different vantage point. And
And,
then
and
when
I
you
think
begin
it's
with the similarities rather than the differences, that's a
yeah,
very different vantage point. Yeah.
yeah. And it seems like if you see a person as a problem versus a third thing, then you it's easy to dehumanize the person versus saying we together are children of the most high. We are inherently valuable. So I may disagree with you how we go about this, but somehow I first and foremost, you are of the utmost value, and I cannot dehumanize. So yeah, that's and I like how you said to rephrase the question and come to the table with what do we have in common, and look for that, because again, then again I'm seeing you as a human. I'm seeing you as um, you're not my enemy. You're my brother and sister. So
Yeah.
that was good.
There's so much to this conversation that I think is absolutely critical
Yeah,
for our life together, not simply in the church, but as a nation.
yeah, for sure. Hey, we could probably cut this out, but we have 6 minutes. I know you have a hard stop, so
And why don't we just got two more kind of outro questions for you. So it should
Great.
be nice and simple. So we've been talking a lot about culture and Christians interacting. What are some materials, books, articles, podcasts, general thinkers that you would recommend, just understanding how America is today, but then also like more broadly, maybe also in understanding how evangelicals can interact with the rapidly secularizing just culture in general.
Yeah, there are several things that I would recommend. One, for the health of the nation, it's a booklet that the NAE has produced, and you can download it at our website, nae.org. The second thing is I would recommend though it's a secular source, it's deeply faith-friendly. A book by Robert Putnam, who's a professor at Harvard, called The Upswing. I think it's been very instrumental in my own understanding of the challenges that we have faced as a nation and ways in which we can learn from our past. Another book I would recommend is The Righteous Mind. Again, not specifically written by a person of faith, but very faith friendly and important to faith communities. And it's why people begin with such different ideological vantage points, and how do you have the possibility of conversation?
Who's the author of
Jonathan Haidt.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Another really interesting book that I'm reading right now is Christ and the Common Life by Luke Brotherton. He's a professor of moral and political theology at Duke Divinity School. And then it's a bit more academic. Something that I think might be more accessible is the book The Dignity Revolution by Dan Darling. And it looks at a variety of issues as a follower of Jesus, and how to be thinking about it from, again, a biblical perspective that is deeply convicted but generous and creative in its approach.
Yeah. I do wonder kind of how would, if America less tablet, less screen time, and got back into books, or got not back into, but we're reading more, how that might shape our minds and help us to better love one another. Let me ask this last question, if we're cool with this. What is something no one is talking about, but you think they should be? Because maybe we'll talk about that on our next podcast.
Well, I mean, you alluded to this in terms of the impact of the tablet, but the long-term kind of generational impact of the different ways that we are accessing information, and the impact of technology on the access of that information. I know that people have been talking about it, but in the cycle of our, crisis moment, it's taken a back seat to the cultural issues, but it is a long-term issue of what does this mean that we are raising generations now who are fundamentally accessing information in a different way,
right,
whose life is mediated through this technology.
Yeah. Man, that's a good one.
Walter, thank you so much for coming on, taking a little bit out of your day, and we'll see you. We'll hopefully see you again, or at least see you next time.
Yes, yeah. Sounds great. Rob, Walt, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.